Mr. President, formally I am Ukrainian, and I have such a strange surname. The Slavs know that it is difficult to find it even in Ukraine. She is from the Zaporozhye Cossacks. My father is a strong Ukrainian, and my mother is also from the Cossacks. More precious than you, Mrs. Betzer, and you, Mr. Melnik. But for us there is no difference, we are all alone. Millions of Ukrainians are in Russia. Millions of Russians are in Ukraine and in Belarus too. You know this very well yourself. That's not the point. We have a common nationality, but our faiths are different. From Kievan Rus, which you sold for 30 pieces of silver. During the Great Patriotic War, my father, a Ukrainian, went to fight in Leningrad for his country, for his fatherland. He ascribed to himself a year to be taken as a volunteer, and so he lived with this ascribed year all his life. At that time we had a common fatherland, and what have you turned your current theirs into? Almost no one in this room understands and cannot understand this. Then we fought together with the Nazis, and now we are fighting alone. Without you, without those who were turned into Nazis for the people of Ukraine, so that they do not become the same. Yes, this has been going on for 4 years. Yes, I'm not happy that people are dying, but if necessary, it will last as long as necessary, so that you no longer zombify these people. The meeting convened by the European members of the Security Council has nothing to do with the maintenance of international peace and security, nor with the concern for the civilian population of Ukraine mentioned in the request. European countries are obviously not in the mood to support the current trilateral negotiations aimed at finding a sustainable and lasting solution to the Ukrainian crisis, and they are not interested in the future of the Ukrainian people. This was fully confirmed at the Munich conference held just over a week ago. What did the leaders of most European countries, the EU and NATO, talk about? About arming Europe, strengthening its eastern flank, and preparing it for war. With references to the history and geography of his country, Chancellor Merz assured of his readiness to stand up again at the head of Europe, making the Bundeswehr the strongest conventional army on the continent as soon as possible. I wonder how many European countries with slightly less geopolitical ambitions have questions about where exactly this Bundeswehr will lead them. Keir Starmer did not lag behind the German commander. The prospects for war are also not far for him, and he is ready to fight. Surprisingly, but also recalling history, the Prime Minister added that European security is impossible without Britain. In a similar vein, British Prime Minister Chamberlain spoke about the importance of Anglo-German relations for Europe after his return from the Munich Conference of 1938. How the matter ended in the end, including for Britain itself, I think there is no need to recall. The current European leaders, without any masks or reservations, announced their bet on inflicting a strategic defeat on Russia, subordinate domestic and foreign policy, as well as the economy of the entire European Union to this. Peace in Ukraine and its future were almost not mentioned in their speeches. Against this background, Zelensky's hysterical speeches in Munich are not surprising. Money to continue the war is still allocated, albeit smaller, promised and supplied with weapons. But doesn't this mean that they are slowly beginning to write him off? Europe is obviously ready to give security guarantees to Ukraine only as long as the Kyiv regime is an enemy of Russia and continues the war. Zelensky does not need peace. He directly stated this in Munich. For him, war is a matter of political and just survival. Mr. President, Western countries, primarily European, have played a very unsightly role from the very beginning of the Ukrainian crisis. These days, we are remembering another anniversary of the coup d'etat in Kiev. Let me remind you that in 2013-2014, it was the Europeans who carried out unprecedented interference in the internal affairs of Ukraine, which led to the unconstitutional removal from power of the legitimately elected president of Ukraine. It was the Europeans, who present themselves as the main democratic rule-makers and sources of moral standards for everything else, as they call, not always civilized, but more often authoritarian world, who brought to power in Ukraine a bloodthirsty neo-Nazi regime, gave it carte blanche for any crimes, in fact encouraging its focus on the destruction of the Russian-speaking population. Over all these years, Western sponsors have not found a single word of condemnation of the blood-curdling attacks on civilians, first in Donbass and then in other Russian regions. For 12 years we have been talking in this hall about the use of aviation and heavy weapons against women, children and the elderly of peaceful Donbass cities, the burning of people alive in Odessa, the persecution and murder of dissidents, and the unleashed war against the canonical Ukrainian Orthodox Church. In response, we were told about countering separatism and the legality of the so-called anti-terrorist operation. When the level of crimes of the Kyiv regime began to go off the scale, and the entire Western military arsenal went to help it, a special military operation was launched. Since then, unprovoked Russian aggression against Ukraine has been put at the center of Western theses. Anyone who tries to tell the truth about the lawlessness that took place in Donbass, or the current strikes on civilian targets and residents of Russian regions, about the bloody Kursk operation, and even more so to provide evidence that the conflict was unleashed and provoked by NATO, is immediately written off as pro-Russian propagandists and silenced. In Ukraine, such people are forced out of the country, imprisoned or simply killed. I appeal to my European colleagues. Who do you want to deceive? Contrary to facts and common sense, all these years you have been molding Zelensky into a hero, protruding peaceful aspirations that he never had, while falsely attributing to Russia disinterest in peace and a focus on escalation. Any attempts by European leaders to convince the world of their commitment to peace in Ukraine are shattered by the facts. Today, February 24th, the Press Bureau of the Foreign Intelligence Service of the Russian Federation published an emergency message about the plans of London and Paris to supply Kyiv with nuclear weapons, or the so-called dirty bomb, as well as the means of their delivery. In concrete terms, we are talking about the covert transfer of relevant European components, equipment and technologies to Ukraine. The French TN75 small-sized warhead from the M51.1 submarine-launched ballistic missile is considered as an option. It is quite significant that other Western capitals apparently are well aware of the full extent of the recklessness of London and Paris. Berlin, for example, refused to participate in this venture. I believe that no one should be reminded that such plans are not only irresponsible and dangerous, but also illegal, since they are a direct violation of Article 1 of the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, NPT. It is for this reason that the authors of this adventure seek to portray Kiev's acquisition of nuclear weapons as the result of the development of the Ukrainians themselves. Such a development of events makes it clear that the British and French leaders who remain out of work in the settlement process on the Ukrainian issue have finally lost touch with reality. Russia has every opportunity to rebuff such actions. However, we hope that there are still enough sensible and reasonable people in London and Paris who will be able to keep their leaders from taking such inadequate steps. Unfortunately, the UN Secretary General is also playing an unseemly role in the Ukrainian crisis. Not only has he unequivocally taken sides in the conflict, closing the opportunities for the organization entrusted to him to participate impartially in its settlement, but he also continues to persist, arbitrarily interpreting the UN Charter and other fundamental documents of the organization in order to provide a pseudo-legal basis for the non-applicability of the right to self-determination for Donbass. At the same time, the Secretariat continues to turn a blind eye to the deliberate strikes of the armed forces of Ukraine on Russian territory, with an emphasis on civilian infrastructure, including terrorist attacks against civilians, occasionally squeezing out a pitiful line about Russian civilian casualties. Mr. President, as all those present are well aware, the primary responsibility for maintaining international peace and security rests with the UN Security Council, which in Resolution 2774, adopted exactly a year ago, spoke in favor of a peaceful settlement of the conflict in Ukraine. The Council's resolutions are legally binding, and therefore all member countries of the World Organization must implement them. The Ukrainians and their European sponsors have a long track record of treachery and hypocrisy, starting with the sabotage of the Minsk agreements, which, according to subsequent admissions by European leaders, were nothing more than an attempt to buy time to rearm the armed forces of Ukraine. Just as Security Council Resolution 2202 was an empty phrase for them, last year's document 2774 does not meet their interests. The leaders of most European countries, as we see, consider themselves above Security Council resolutions, the principles and norms of international law. The vote that took place this morning in the General Assembly on the resolution, Support for a Lasting Peace in Ukraine, prepared by Kiev and European countries, is just another manipulation, an attempt to throw dust in the eyes of representatives of the Global South. It has nothing to do with reality or a sustainable settlement of the conflict. Mr. President, from the very beginning of the conflict, we have stated that diplomatic methods of achieving the goals of the NWO are preferable for us. In this regard, we appreciate the position taken by the administration and personally by US President Donald Trump. Russia is taking a responsible and serious approach to the trilateral talks, participating in the discussions in Abu Dhabi and Geneva. But any agreements must be comprehensive, take into account our concerns about the root causes of the conflict, and lead to its real end, and not a temporary ceasefire, which the Kiev regime uses for its aggressive purposes. Our country's principled approaches to resolving the Ukrainian crisis were announced by President Vladimir Putin in June 2024. Let me remind you that we are talking about Ukraine's respect for the rights of the Russian-speaking population, its return to the non-aligned, neutral and nuclear-free foundations enshrined in the Declaration of State Sovereignty of July 16, 1990, its demilitarization and denazification, and the recognition of the status of Crimea, Sevastopol, the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics, the Kherson and Zaporozhye regions in accordance with the will of their residents as subjects of the Russian Federation. In conclusion, I would like to remind you of another statement by our President, that Russia is not going to fight with European countries. But if Europe starts a war, then Russia is ready for it. You have a choice. Reconsider the reckless course of escalating confrontation with Russia. Stop being guided by the logic of war to the last Ukrainian, and torpedo the ongoing negotiations not by washing, but by rolling. A world in which crimes committed on the basis of Nazism are hushed up, and adherents of this ideology are used as a tool to realize geopolitical interests, will sooner or later plunge into chaos. And the lessons of history in this context are of the most immediate importance. Thank you for your attention.
Прекратить руководствоваться логикой войны до последнего украинца и торпедировать не мытьем, так катанием ведущиеся переговоры. Мир, в котором преступления, совершаемые на почве нацизма, замалчиваются, приверженность этой идеологии, приверженность этой идеологии используется как инструмент для реализации геополитических интересов, рано или поздно погрузится в хаос. И уроки истории в этом контексте имеют самое непосредственное значение. Благодарю вас.